Okay, I think we can probably start. So tonight I'm intending to talk about the nature of pleasure in Buddhism, what pleasure means, how it has various different connotations, what sort of pleasures we should be looking for in Buddhism, and what sort of pleasures we should avoid. And this is one of the most fascinating things to me about Buddhism. Has always been this simple idea that Buddhism is about happiness and it's about pleasure. It's about feeling good. That's what Buddhism really is about. And that to me was always the thing that made it so powerful, because I knew I wanted to be happy. I wanted to avoid suffering and problems in life. So because of that, straight away when I heard that the Buddhist teachings talked about these particular things, I thought, yes, this is exactly the kind of teaching I'm after. Avoid suffering and find happiness in one way or another. There's something very powerful about that. We all know that this is what we want for ourselves. We don't want to be more sad or more depressed or anything like that. We'd rather have more happiness in life, right? So then when Buddhism gives you a path that promises you that, in fact it promises you that to a higher and higher degree until you achieve what in Buddhism is called the complete end of suffering, then to me that is basically the meaning of life, right? The meaning of life is to find that sense of fulfillment where there isn't any higher happiness to be obtained, where you come to an end of your search for happiness and you have discovered the, if you like, the ultimate pleasure, which is equivalent to also the ending of all suffering. So, but we need to discuss what pleasure actually means. There's different types of pleasures in the world, and there are certain pleasures to be pursued, certain pleasures which are beneficial for the path of practice, and certain pleasures that actually are a hindrance to that path of practice. But before I even talk about pleasure, I want to talk a little bit first of all about pain. Because pain is the flip side of pleasure, right? And it is remarkable how important this too is in the Buddha's teachings. One of the very first things the Buddha says after his awakening, one of the very first things he talks about is the middle way, right? The middle way is the way which is between, on the one hand, basically producing pain in the body, producing problems for the body and the mind on the one hand, on the other hand, indulgence in sensual pleasures. So this is the very first teaching, the first thing the Buddha says, avoid pain. So this is obviously very important. So why does the Buddha emphasize this pain straight away so strongly as he does? And one obvious reason why that is the case is because he had just been practicing ascetic practices for 5 or 6 years, according to the traditional story, before his awakening. So obviously he wants to just say, well, I made a mistake, right? And the Buddha actually says that in the suttas. He says that this was a mistake, I was going in the wrong way, because at that time I still had wrong view. It's interesting that the Buddha says that about himself. I had wrong view. It makes it very clear that he was basically an ordinary person at this time, like most other people. So he wanted to warn people, don't follow me, don't do what I did. I made a mistake, don't do this. Find the middle path instead. So this is obviously one reason. He was going from his own history, from his own experience. This is dangerous. This doesn't lead in the right direction. And the second reason I think why he emphasized this is that there seems to be something in the human mind, the human heart, which thinks that pain is good, pain is going to be beneficial, pain is going to lead to some kind of spiritual benefit. And the reason it seems that way is because when you look around the world, you look at the various spiritual traditions where they have meditation, or they try to attain some sort of spiritual goal, almost in all of those traditions, this idea of inflicting pain on the body, or even inflicting pain on the mind, is considered often a good thing, right? The Christians do it, the Muslims apparently do it, we know that the Hindus do it, and for goodness sake, the Buddhists too do it. It's amazing. We have this very clear teaching, and still, in Buddhism, still this happens, that people almost literally inflict pain on the body by sitting in a still posture for hour upon hour and being in agony. This is a kind of pain that we often inflict in Buddhist circles. So there's something very deep-seated in human nature that seems to think that through pain, either in the body or the mind, somehow some kind of spiritual benefit will be derived from that. And I think it is fairly obvious how that works. It's because we experience pleasure through the body, right? The five senses are a source of pleasure. In fact, that is in part what it is to be a human, is to experience pleasure through the five senses. So what people are trying to do, presumably, is to counteract that pleasure that we experience through the five senses, counteract it with pain, and in a sense neutralize the pleasure by experiencing painful feelings instead. But the Buddha said it's the wrong way. It doesn't work. And the reason why it doesn't work, you're not actually counteracting anything at all. What you're doing instead, you're continuing to make the body important. If you experience pleasure through the senses, the body is important because that's where you find happiness. If you experience pain through the five senses, the body is still important because now you want to get rid of the pain, right? That's just another way of finding happiness. So you're making the body important again, and that's why it doesn't work. So if you want to focus on spiritual practice, if you want to work with the mind and you want to get rid of the body, the answer is always you have to neither have pleasure in the body nor pain. And that's when the body falls away. I don't know if you noticed that in the meditation just now. When you start to calm down and the tension in the body disappears and there's not much pleasure happening, nothing is really happening. After a while, the body sort of starts to disappear from your consciousness, right? It's not important anymore. And you start to kind of withdraw into yourself. The senses become less important. I'm sure you've all noticed that sometimes in your meditation practice, how that actually works. That is very nice. It's very pleasant when the body disappears, right? It's a very beautiful thing. And then you can start working with the mind. And then you can make some sort of spiritual progress. So let's get the pain out of the way. Of course, life is not such that it's possible to always live without pain. That's absolutely impossible. Sometimes we're going to experience displeasure. The body is such that sometimes you will have pain in the body, and that's okay. There's certain pains that cannot be dismissed, that you cannot let go of. But let's not produce pain, make pain, where pain actually does not have to exist. Let's not make it worse than it actually is. And there are certain pains in the world, certain pains that a spiritual practitioner will have to experience. For example, sometimes if you're going to keep the precepts, then sometimes you have to say no to things that you would like to do, right? There's a certain amount of displeasure in having to say no to something you really want. But it's very short term, and in the long term, you experience instead, of course, the happiness of doing what is right, of doing what is good. So this is the first thing. We get the pain out of the way. Buddhism is not about pain. There's no need to experience excessive pain in Buddhism. So let's put that aside instead. And instead, let's have a look at the pleasures, which the Buddha really says is the Buddhist path. The Buddhist path is all about happiness. It's all about pleasure. And this is what is so wonderful about this path. But to understand what this means, it's important to also see how the Buddha actually divided up pleasure into two different aspects. And one of those aspects is what he calls the worldly pleasures. And these are the pleasures that we get through the five senses. These are pleasures that come through things like power, like being well-liked by people around you, having a good reputation, whatever it is, things that you like, basically, in the world. These are the worldly happinesses. And in particular, we're talking about the pleasure of the five senses is particularly important here, because this concerns all of us, basically. So that is one side of pleasure. The other side of pleasure is the spiritual pleasures. And the spiritual pleasures are the pleasure you have when you do something kind to somebody else. You do something kind spontaneously. How do you feel inside when you do that? If you do something kind spontaneously, often you feel a sense of joy inside, right? You do something, and that joy, which is derived from being kind, being generous, having compassion, having a sense of peace, all these kind of things. Now that is what we mean by spiritual happiness. And these two happinesses are very different from each other. And I encourage you to investigate inside of yourself to see the difference between these happinesses. Because once you start to understand the difference, you understand what is really to be sought for, what actually is important in life, what matters. So let's try to think a little bit about the difference between sensual happiness and the spiritual happiness. Once you put these things into words, once you think a little bit about it, often it becomes more clear. You may have an intuition, you may have a kind of sense what is right and what is wrong, but thinking about it can sometimes strengthen that intuition even more and make it more powerful. So why this difference? Why these two different types of happiness? And the first thing which differentiates these types of happiness is that the worldly happiness, generally speaking, you can only have so much control over worldly happiness. The world tends to go in a certain way, it goes in a certain direction. Sometimes you succeed, sometimes you don't. Sometimes things go in the way you want them to, sometimes they don't. And we know what it's like in life. Right now they say that the Australian economy isn't going so well anymore. It's kind of plateauing out or whatever. I'm not sure exactly what's going on because I don't read all that many newspapers. But sometimes you have depressions or in the economy, right? What happens when you have that? People's income, real income, stagnates or perhaps even falls. And then they can't go on the holiday overseas that they're used to doing. They can't perhaps indulge themselves in the way they used to. And that is experienced as suffering for most people. And what does it come from? It comes from something over which you have absolutely no control. The economy is certainly going in a different direction, and you find that you are affected by that. Maybe they cut your salary. Maybe you lose your job. Who knows what's happening? You are not in charge of this world of the five senses. Things tend to go according to other laws, the laws of economics, the laws of whatever, but not the law that you would like it to follow. Same thing, of course, with partnerships in life, right? You may have a wonderful partner in life, and one day, you might think they are wonderful, but one day they decide to leave you because they have found somebody even more wonderful in their views. Or they die. These things happen, right? People die. And then again, you feel the sense of lack inside. Something you had has disappeared. And you can see this is the same across the board. One day you come back home, somebody has burgled your house, and they've taken some of your prized possessions. Again, you feel sad because your prized possessions have disappeared. The world of the five senses is uncertain. You never know what's going to happen next. So remember that uncertainty in that world. The world, on the other hand, of the spiritual happiness is precisely the world over which you have some control. Because this is about how you are, right? This is about morality. It's about virtue. It's about how you act in the world. The Pali word for this is the word sila. The word sila means something like virtue, but it actually means more than that. It just means conduct quite generally. And this world of conduct is something you can do something about. Sometimes you will fail, sometimes the circumstances will be so strong you won't be able to do what you'd like to do. But generally speaking, you have a sense of control over that world. And precisely because you have a sense of control over it, it means you are able to create happiness through that world. The sense world is uncertain, but the inner world you have some degree of control over. So why don't we instead of pursuing things we can't really do anything about anyway in the end, why not instead pursue that world inside over which we can actually do something about? So this is the first distinction. That's a very kind of shallow distinction between sensual pleasures and spiritual happiness. There is other very important distinctions between the two. And one very important one is that sensual happiness, the one that comes to the five senses, is usually tied up with craving, tied up with desire, tied up with always looking for things, always searching for things out there, always running around trying to get something else. And this is a very big part of the problem of that sensual happiness. If you haven't got any real happiness inside of you, maybe you get something nice in the world, you have maybe a good relationship with somebody, you have a nice house, everything is going quite well. But unless you have a sense of contentment inside of you, that external happiness, that happiness you derive from the outside, is not going to be able to fill up that hole inside of you because you haven't got a real sense of contentment, right? That hole is still going to be there. You can try to fill it up with external things, but it's never actually going to fill up that if there is a lack inside of you. If you don't feel fulfilled, if you don't feel complete, you can keep on craving and craving and craving, running after the sensual pleasures of the world, and it's never going to make any difference in the end. And this, of course, is exactly what happens to people, right? People go from one sense pleasure, that doesn't fulfill them because there's something missing inside, and then they have to go for another one. And so it goes on and on and on. And for most people, the penny never drops that actually this is not going to work. This is not going to result in that happiness that I'm actually seeking for. The craving just keeps going on. And that is the problem. Often we actually like to crave, because when you crave, you have a feeling that you're moving towards something good, right? You have a feeling that you're moving towards a pleasure, something which is going to fulfill you. So the craving itself becomes a positive thing. You think this is a good thing, and it masks the sense of lack that most people have inside of them. It blots that out. So you don't have to feel the sense of lack inside of you. Instead, you crave, and then you get the object. And then when you get the object of craving, you feel kind of empty, right? It wasn't really as great as you thought it would be. And then soon enough afterwards, you start craving again. And you run after it. You think, this time, yes. Then you feel empty again. You get that new car. After a while, the new car isn't so exciting. You need another new car. And so it goes on and on and on. But of course, there is a solution to that. And the solution to that is, instead of looking for happiness in the craving, is to look instead for the happiness in the spiritual happiness. Because the spiritual happiness is not about craving. It is exactly the opposite of craving. It's the happiness of being content right here and now. When you do something kind to somebody else and you feel happiness because of that, there is no craving involved in that. There's just a natural sense of happiness. You're content in the present because the present moment is beautiful, right? And that is why there's no running around anymore. For the first time in your life, you feel a sense of fulfillment. You feel complete. You feel there is no lack inside. And when there is no lack inside, there is no craving, right? That's the very nature of craving. You don't need to get anything else because you feel complete. You feel that there is no lack. So these two are diametrically opposite things. The craving comes from lack, it derives from lack, whereas the spiritual happiness fulfills you, and for that reason there is no craving involved. This is how opposite they are. And it's very obvious which one is more fulfilling. It's very obvious which one actually really matters in life. Contemplate that, think about that. There is a nice simile in the suttas where the Buddha talks about sensual happiness and sensual craving. And the Buddha says that sensuality is like a dog which eats a bone. You throw a bone to a dog, a bone, there's basically no meat, there's maybe a tiny bit of meat and a little bit of blood on this bone. And then the dog eats this bone, just gets kind of a taste of something. It doesn't really satisfy her. It is just as hungry after it's tasted the bone, maybe more hungry, because now the craving has become stronger, because you had a taste of the sensuality, but there's no satisfaction there. And that is exactly what sensual pleasures are. You get this taste, but there's no fulfillment, there's no final satisfaction. It just keeps on going on. You don't feel complete inside of you. And this is the problem. What we really want is completion. What sensuality promises you, what craving promises you, that when you get this, you will feel a sense of completion. And of course, it doesn't happen. You have to look somewhere else. Well, this is one of the very important distinctions between the sensual happiness and the spiritual happiness. Please contemplate that and look at this for yourself, and only then does it become really powerful and very meaningful to you. Then there is another reason, another distinction between the sensual happiness and the spiritual happiness, and that is the fact that the sensual happiness has a certain degree of impurity about it. Whereas the spiritual happiness has the opposite. It has a sense of purity about it. It feels pure. And again, you need to feel this to really understand what's going on. So what is that impurity in sensual happiness? Why is it impure? And one reason why it's impure is because it always focuses around you, right? Me. I need my desires fulfilled. There's always a vested interest that you have when there's desire. So even if you have a beautiful relationship with somebody, if it involves a certain degree of attachment or desire, you have a vested interest in that relationship. The love you have is not going to be pure. The compassion you have is not going to be impure. It's not going to be pure. Even the kindness you have is not going to be pure. There's a certain degree of impurity when you have a vested interest, a certain degree of selfishness in that relationship. Of course, the degree of these things will vary enormously. I'm not saying that everybody is, really bad and we're all utterly selfish. That's not really the point. I'm just saying that there's always a little bit of that in there when you have a relationship based on desire and based on attachment. So the spiritual happiness, on the other hand, there isn't that. The spiritual happiness is just that you do something kind towards somebody else simply because you want to do something kind, right? You do an act of kindness towards a stranger on the street. When you do an act of kindness towards a stranger on the street, there is no vested interest for you whatsoever in that act. So you do that act of kindness, and that is a pure act of kindness. There's no vested interest, there's no selfishness, there's no attachment, none of that. It's just coming from you, just because you want to be kind. And again, this is the spiritual happiness compared to the worldly happiness or the sensual happiness. These are some of the differences, and it is very useful to reflect on that. Sometimes we don't think enough about the difference between these things. We don't feel it enough. We don't feel it deeply enough. And for that reason, we don't really understand it. But once you start to see that, I think you will see very obvious which one is more valuable in your life, which one really matters, and which one is not so important. And of course, the spiritual happiness, just the fact of feeling happy, a sense of joy when you give something to somebody else, or you help them out, or you say something kind, that's a very weak kind of joy. It's very beautiful, but it's still just at the beginning stages. It takes off from there and just increases and magnifies. And this is the sort of thing that you experience through profound meditation practice, for example. So this is the difference, and because of this difference, it's actually quite important to be able to distinguish between these things. And sometimes as a monk, one of the problems that I encounter as a monk sometimes, and it happened to me a couple of weeks ago, I think, something like that, and people tell you that, you're a monk, you don't know anything about sensual happiness. In fact, your life is unnatural. You can't, this is unnatural to live a celibate life like a monk. It's like a challenge, right? You shouldn't be doing this. This is not right. Basically, that's what they keep saying. And is it really unnatural to live a celibate life? Is that a valid argument to say that? And it's the nice thing about getting a challenge. Sometimes it makes you think, right? It makes you think, well, actually, on the surface of it, it doesn't seem all that wrong, right? It is a bit unnatural. Almost everybody else don't live this kind of life. Everybody else has relationships. Maybe I'm a bit weird. Could it be that I'm weird? And the answer is no, I don't think it is weird at all. I think it's a misapplication of the word natural to say that it's unnatural to live a monastic or a celibate life. First of all, two reasons I think it is not unnatural. The first one is that we all restrain ourselves a lot of the time. We don't let our natural urges of whatever it is in the world of sensuality, whatever it might be, we can't always follow our natural urges. In fact, a vast majority of the time we have to restrain ourselves. We can't just do things, otherwise the world doesn't function anymore. In particular, if you are a good Buddhist and you want to keep the 5 precepts, you certainly have to restrain yourself. You might see somebody of the opposite gender who you find attractive, But you are already committed in a relationship, so you have to use restraint. You have to say, no, I don't want to do that. This is going to destroy my beautiful happiness of being virtuous. I don't want to destroy that for some crazy idea right now. So you restrain yourself. Restraint is part and parcel of human life. You have to have that. So the difference between a monastic then who lives a celibate life and somebody who doesn't live a celibate life is not a difference of kind. It's not as if there's a complete difference here. It's only a difference of degree, right? A monastic, you may have to restrain yourself a little bit more than as a layperson, but basically it is the same idea that we're dealing with. Restraint always has to be there. There isn't really that much difference between us after all. In fact, we could even say that as an ordinary person living in the world, there is so many sensory impacts that actually come in all the time through advertisements, through seeing people around you, through all kinds of things. And that sensory input you get often makes it more difficult in lay life, right? In a monastery, if you live in the forest all the time, all you see is trees and grass and a few kangaroos. There isn't very much to stimulate you in any way whatsoever. It's actually sometimes easier. So, I don't know if this is true, but you could maybe make the argument that actually it is easier to be restrained as a monastic than it is as a layperson, because you don't have all the temptations that always harass you, so to speak, in ordinary life. At least that's one way of looking at it. I'm not sure if that is actually quite true, but I think there's some truth to that anyway. And that's, of course, why. This is precisely why, as a monastic who lives a celibate life, that you do actually live away. You live outside of the city and you live in the forest. It's very suitable and very conducive to the monastic style of life. So that's the first thing why it's not unnatural. And the other reason why it is not unnatural to live a celibate life, I think the reason why people say it's unnatural is because they think that desire, particularly desire for a partner in life, is intrinsic to a human being. You have to have this desire. It's impossible to avoid it. And that's why it is unnatural not to kind of pursue that kind of desire. Is it really intrinsic to a human being? Is it absolutely necessary to have these desires, specifically desires for the opposite gender? Is that intrinsic to a human being? Or is it perhaps not? And one of the the immediate things that you think about when you think about that is that, well, first of all, people in the world have very different strengths and degrees of desire, right? Desire varies enormously. Why does desire vary so enormously here? And the answer is that one reason is, there are many reasons, but one reason is that we look at the world in different ways. We contemplate, we perceive the world in different ways. And that difference in perception is what ultimately leads to a difference in desire and a difference in how attracted we are to the objects of the senses. So what is that perception that is different? And it's very simple. The difference is simply that a person who has a lot of desire is a person who sees a lot of beauty and attractiveness in the object that they are attracted to, right? If you see something very attractive, then you get desire for that object, whatever it is. But the person who doesn't have so much desire, perhaps the reason is that they see something beautiful somewhere else. They see the beauty inside of themselves, the beauty that comes from spiritual practice. Or they see the limitations of the world outside. Remember what I was just saying before. You cannot control the world outside, right? And they realize that, okay, I find this beautiful partner, and then they leave me. Eventually they will leave you. Eventually they will die. Something will happen eventually. Or whatever else it is, if it is a house or if it is belongings, you cannot ultimately control these things. There is a large degree of uncertainty there. So the person who remembers impermanence, remembers how uncertain these things are, does not see the same degree of attraction in the world of the five senses as a person who forgets about impermanence, forgets about the downside. You forget about the downside, all you see is the beauty, and the desire becomes very strong. And that is ultimately the difference in people. The difference for why you are attracted to this world and why you are not is how you look at the world, how you perceive the world. So my point is not that you should go around trying to sort of think of all sensual pleasures as terrible and nasty and all these kind of things. Sometimes people take these things to an extreme. They start reading the Buddha's teaching and think, oh, the Buddha said we should abandon sensual pleasures. Okay, I'm going to give it all up and now I'm going to live as a monastic straight away. And of course what happens if you do that, if you give everything up straight away, you abandon it, what happens is you suffer. You suffer because you are doing things too fast, you're doing things in the wrong order, you're pushing things away, while actually what you should be doing is doing a gradual movement in the right direction, not just chucking everything out, because then it will become very, very hard for you. Okay, no more movies, no more music, no more partner in life, no more nice food, just rice and water, and then of course life becomes unbearable, absolutely unbearable, and you can't do it anymore. So what should you do then? Okay, what you should do is this. You should start practicing the spiritual life. You should start to understand that kindness and compassion for others is something beautiful. And the person it is most beautiful for is yourself, right? And what happens when you do that? What happens when you do that is that you start to get this happiness inside of you. That lack you have inside of you, the hole inside of you, the lack of fulfillment starts to get filled up. And when that hole inside of you starts to get filled up, you start to feel more complete. You won't desire things so much anymore. So you can see it as a natural process. The craving starts to die away precisely because the lack you had before is no longer there. So you fill up this demand inside of yourself with something else. That's something else which is very beautiful and very contented in the present moment. And then the desires die down by themselves. This is really the best way to do it. If you do it in that way, you don't really have to worry too much about trying to restrain yourself or hold back on the sensual pleasures. Of course, don't break the 5 precepts, be wise about these things, but you don't have to sort of become, go to kind of extreme ends in this kind of area. Instead, you just focus on doing what is right, and then gradually this change happens by itself. Sometimes you also remind yourself of the danger in that world of sensuality. Remind yourself enough, you don't get kind of pulled in. But generally speaking, it's just about doing what is right, doing what is good, and then things will change all by themselves. This is the ideal way of doing it, and then you don't create unnecessary suffering for yourself. And this is the beauty of this path. And the way that you fill that hole inside of yourself, the way you make yourself feel fulfilled and complete is basically by being kind, by having a good heart, right? What is that kindness? What is that good-heartedness? This is what we talk about as conduct again. Conduct in Buddhism is not to do the bad things, right? Including not to do the bad things of mind. Not to avoid anger, to avoid all these negative states that sometimes arise in the mind. But also, and this is one of the, I think, things in Buddhism which are so important, virtue and morality or conduct in Buddhism is not just about avoiding the bad. Yes, we need to avoid the bad. We should also do the good, right? This is part of it. Do kind acts. Be generous. Be kind in your speech. Think kind thoughts. This is what metta meditation is about, right? Think kind thoughts about other people. What a wonderful thing that is to think kindly about other people. Give them the benefit of the doubt. Don't judge them too harshly. All these kind of things. Then you are practicing morality at a very deep level, a very beautiful level. And as you do that, the whole inside of yourself, this need, the sense that you are not complete, it starts to fill in. And you start to feel a holistic sense inside of you. I'm whole as a person. What a wonderful thing that is. And the deeper, the further you go on this path, the more whole, the more complete you start to feel. Then craving really starts to die down. Why crave when you're already complete? There's nothing to crave for, right? You're already fulfilled. There's nothing more to search for out there. How powerful that is. And then this morality, this conduct which is positive, that then becomes the basis for the rest of the spiritual life. When you have that happiness inside of you that comes from kindness, that comes from feeling good about yourself, then meditation becomes possible. Meditation is based on happiness. Meditation cannot happen without happiness. And this is where the happiness comes from. And this is why virtue and morality is so fundamental to the Buddhist path. Build up the virtue, get the natural sense of happiness. Then when you sit back and you close your eyes, you feel there's a background happiness always there. And particularly when you turn off the senses and you make the body fade away, that background happiness comes to the fore and it propels you in meditation practice. And then the meditation practice itself multiplies the happiness. It becomes more and more powerful, and then it takes you through these beautiful states until eventually you are so content and so happy that no craving can exist in you whatsoever anymore. You feel fulfilled, 100% fulfilled for the first time in your life. That is one way of looking at deep meditation. It has a sense of complete fulfillment. No more search is required. You have come home finally. You know, this is it. There's no more looking around for anything else. And it is all based on one thing, and that is the virtue and the conduct that you have to practice in ordinary life. And this then is the spiritual happiness. Can you see how beautiful that is? How it actually is the answer to the meaning of life? This is what we're all looking for, isn't it? The sense of completion. No more running around trying to find anything, because we have found it. This is what we're actually looking for here. And this is why the Buddha's teaching, as far as I'm concerned, is the answer to the very meaning of life. Because this is what we actually want. So this is the spiritual happiness, the beauty of the spiritual happiness, and why it is so much more valuable than the happiness of the world. But again, just to remind you, this doesn't mean that we chuck out the worldly happiness, because then you become too miserable. Rather, you gradually transform yourself. Transform yourself from someone who uses the worldly happiness in the wise way to somebody who gradually lets go of that and moves to something which is just so much more beautiful, so much more profound. And then you really understand why you are a spiritual person, why you're somebody who wants to have a good heart, why you are somebody who practicing the Buddhist path. Okay, that is my talk for this evening here. Okay, does anybody have any questions? At the very back there, okay. I think we need a microphone. Yeah, Drew, if you can please pass it on to her.
Thank you. I was under the impression that if I meditate, I would be happy. I heard you say a little while ago that meditation is based on being happy. Now, if I'm not happy, how can I meditate?
Okay.
You know.
Okay, well, meditation is many things to different people, right? And it has many different functions depending on what function you give it. But what I'm talking about here is meditation in a very profound sense, the real deep meditation that the Buddha is talking about. But meditation prior to that is just a large part of the meditation practice we do. Is also just learning how to see the world in a new way, right? So even though you don't feel happy to start with, you actually learn to look at the world in a different way. So this is what metta meditation is about. Metta, loving kindness meditation, right? It's about learning how to see the world in a new way. The reason you haven't got metta, you haven't got loving kindness. Metta actually means something more like friendliness, but the reason why you haven't got that is because you're not perceiving the people around you in the right way to enable that to happen. So you learn to perceive people in a new way, and this is part of the meditation practice. So in a sense, there's different stages here to the meditation practice. There is the initial things where we just learn the basics, so to speak, and then there's the real meditation, the real thing, right? Which is the deep things, and that comes from happiness. But the whole thing kind of leads in the same direction eventually. Yeah. Anybody else like to say anything? Yes. You're going to need a microphone, I think. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
I can see the absolutely beautiful value in living a virtuous life, but having grown up in a different religious upbringing that was had a lot of rules and guilt attached to it, sometimes it tends to get mixed up with a feeling of right and wrong rather than that nice pure beauty of just pure virtue, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
And when it's part of your upbringing, it's sometimes hard to distinguish those two things.
Sure, yeah. I know what you mean. And this can also happen in monastic life. In monastic life we have so many rules, you wouldn't believe it. There's absolutely, bogged down with the rules sometimes. But the idea is to change your perception of those rules and try to see them in a positive way, right? This is really what it's all about. Okay, so you have rules in Buddhism. Well, first of all, the rules in Buddhism are just guidelines. And this is very different from Christianity. I assume maybe you have a Christian background, perhaps. There are commandments, right? So of course, if it is a commandment, then if you break it, it's very bad. But in Buddhism, it's like, okay, I broke a rule. That was a mistake. It was unfortunate. But in the given circumstances, I probably didn't have any choice. I was conditioned in such a way. The influence around me was such that I moved in that direction. I can forgive myself. It doesn't matter. I will try again next time. If you make it into a guilt trip, you're actually much more unlikely to be able to keep the rule in the future. If you are cool about it and you say, I forgive myself, let me see if there is a way I can avoid falling into that situation. You use your rational mind. You use your intuition rather than using guilt. It's much more powerful. That's what I found in my practice. Whenever I sort of trip up with anything, I ask myself coolly instead, why did that happen? How can I avoid that in the future? So this is some of the ways. In Buddhism, rules are not meant for guilt at all. They're meant as guidelines. And in Buddhism, the rules are really just an expression of a more profound truth. And that profound truth is the truth of having a good heart, right? It's really about goodness and kindness. And these rules are just an expression of this goodness and kindness. So how can you be good? How can you be kind? That is the question you should perhaps ask yourself. Forget about the rules for a while and see what happens.
Thank you. Yeah, that's actually quite helpful. But it's really that feeling of being driven by guilt to do good, rather than wanting to do good for goodness' sake.
Right. Yeah.
But what you're saying is a way of actually approaching it differently.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Anybody else have anything to say?
I have a question. Is this on? How do you deal with bodily discomfort?
Bodily discomfort,
in terms of when you're meditating.
Okay.
If you have some sort of severe, if you have some sort of bodily pain or some sort of thing, how do you deal with that?
Sure.
When you're trying to meditate?
How do you deal with bodily discomfort? I'm just going to repeat it. How do you deal with bodily discomfort when you meditate? Yeah. Okay. The first thing is just to find a position that you can actually sit in. So if you find sitting on the floor difficult, for most people these days, because we have grown up sitting on chairs, it can be quite hard to sit on the floor. It's quite difficult. If you sat on a chair all your life, it's actually quite hard. I mean, I've been a monk now for almost 20 years. I was sitting cross-legged a lot, and usually it's quite comfortable. But even now, I sometimes find it uncomfortable. So use a chair if you have to. That's fine to use a chair. It's not a problem at all. That's why we have all these chairs over here. And basically, meditation is not about posture. It doesn't have to be a particular posture. Meditation is about any posture where the body is comfortable. So find that posture where the body is comfortable. Don't, however, expect absolute comfort. That's impossible. The body is never going to be absolutely comfortable. It just doesn't work like that. So a little bit of pain is okay. But when the pain becomes so strong that it overpowers your mind and you can't take your attention away from it, then it's too much. So if that happens and you are already sitting in a certain way, change your posture, move. Sit in a different way, right? Use some of these meditation stools. Take an extra cushion, Sometimes we see people with cushions everywhere around them. I've seen those on retreats sometimes, like this kind of cushions. And it's okay, it's fine. Don't feel embarrassed about that. That's perfectly fine, Find something which works for you, something which is comfortable. That's the most important thing, yeah. Yeah.
If it's in everyday life, if it's just a part of your life, how is something that you sort of have to learn how to do individually?
So you're saying that when you have a pain that is kind of more permanent in a sense, chronic pain in your life, yeah. But that is a different situation, and that is more difficult to deal with. So what you have to do there is you just, in a sense, you have to learn how to kind of accept that pain, accept that there is pain is there, and learn first of all just to sit with it, focus it, allow it to be, and then try. Basically, the idea is not to crave for the pain to disappear. If you don't crave for the pain to disappear, it won't be a problem. The reason it's a problem is because you're desiring it to disappear. So try to find the ease with the pain. Try to kind of be at ease with it. Okay, pain, I allow you to be there. It doesn't matter. It's okay. You know, this is my body. I will look after my body. This is what you are like, body. I love you anyway. And when you have that love for your body, right? I mean, it actually works, because when you love something, it's no longer a problem. So it's about changing your perception, changing the way you look at these things, and then you can actually see things in a different way. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Yes, over here.
This might be a silly question, but if you have severe pain, is it against the guidelines to take some heavy kind of painkiller for it?
Okay. No, it's not against the guidelines at all. If we have a problem, we're allowed to deal with those problems. That's perfectly okay. It depends on what kind of painkiller it is. Sometimes a painkiller can make you very drowsy, or very kind of, it can do all kind of other things to you as well. So it can have negative side effects, for sure. But if you need to, of course, you use a painkiller as well. This is one of the advantages of living in that world, that we have medicines for these things, and we use those medicines wisely. As monks, we do exactly the same thing. If we have a problem, we also use medicines in that way. So experiment a little bit. If it does detract from your meditation practice, then try to see if you can find a kind of a middle way, perhaps, or something like that. But it's certainly not against the Buddhist idea of morality, that's for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to take a few questions from overseas. This is from Dirayupa in Thailand. Hello, Dirayupa. What is your opinion about an inquisitive mind? I'm always curious and want to get answers. It's kind of a craving. Okay, craving for knowledge. Should I practice contentment about not knowing, or should I pursue the knowledge? Okay. Yes, I know what you mean. Sometimes people are very keen on knowledge, and of course it depends on what kind of knowledge it is, right? Certain knowledge might be very useful, or the knowledge might not be all that useful from a spiritual point of view. And of course the kind of knowledge which isn't that useful is all the worldly knowledge, right? Particularly if you are really keen on reading the gossip columns in newspapers, it's not likely to be all that useful. Actually, it would probably detract from your spiritual practice. But even knowledge about all kind of worldly things, the very inquisitive things, if you're always inquisitive, always desiring that for whatever reason, then of course, if it then affects your meditation practice, if you start thinking about all those things that, I would like to know about this, like to know about that, then it's going to become a problem, right? So for that reason, it's good to know when to have an inquisitive mind and when not to have it, and to be able to let go at the right time. This is kind of one of those tricks to be able to know the right time. But then there's also the inquisitiveness about the Dhamma, right? And again, it's a similar kind of thing about the Dhamma as well, about the Buddha's teachings. Of course, it's good to understand what this teaching is about, but there is a time and a place even for that. And when you do meditation practice, when you want to become peaceful, that is not the time to think about the Dhamma. So you have to train yourself. You have to remind yourself that if I'm going to become peaceful, then this is not the right time to think about these things. Push them to one side. Remind yourself that if you have a successful meditation, then on the other side of that meditation, your mind is going to become so much more clear. And with a more clear mind, you can actually absorb more information. So if you want to get information, that is probably the right time to do it. That is the right time to understand things. That's the right time to gain more wisdom. So try just to train your mind to inquire at the right time and not inquire at the wrong time. Oops. That I think that is really the clue here. And if you understand the happiness of meditation, then you won't be so inquisitive while you do the meditation practice. Okay, so next one is from Marcus from Germany. And Marcus, hello Marcus. Marcus says here, Ajahn Shah said that there is no happiness, but only the ending and ceasing of suffering. How does this relate to those worldly and spiritual pleasures and happiness that you mentioned in the beginning of your talk? Do they exist? Yes, they certainly exist. Happiness certainly is there. There's no doubt about that. But the problem with the Buddhist teaching is that it is incredibly profound. And the most profound view of the Buddhist teaching is to regard basically everything as suffering. And this is because everything is suffering compared to the highest happiness, which is Nibbana. And that is why even the most ecstatic feeling you can have, even the highest bliss that is possible in the deepest meditation, and it is bliss, it is powerful, it is definitely there, but the complete cessation, or the complete ending, or the complete experience of Nibbana is more profound still. And from the standpoint of Nibbana, even the highest conceivable happiness actually looks like suffering when you look back. But this is very, very profound, right? And there's no point even thinking about this until you get a little bit of happiness in your meditation practice. You have to do these things gradually. If you jump straight to the everything is suffering and I want to make everything cease, then you're going to lose. You may just say, okay, Buddhism is mad. I don't want to have anything to do with Buddhism. And you never get anywhere. So start off a little bit with those things that are straight there, because there's so much beauty to be had on this Buddhist path. And then as you do that, you will start to see that some of the things that before you thought were happiness, actually, on recollection, there's a lot of suffering in those things, right? I was talking before about the craving in sensual pleasure. Now, the craving in sensual pleasure actually is an aspect of suffering because it's a lack of fulfillment, right? Now, that craving seems like happiness, but then it turns out to be suffering after all. And this is how the spiritual path works. You go higher and higher on the path, and then when you look back on the previous stages, you realize that what you had before actually was not the happiness that you thought it was. And this is how you work through this. So I'm certainly not going to argue with somebody like Ajahn Shah. He's definitely right, but remember that Ajahn Shah probably is talking to a monastic audience who is very familiar with the Buddha's teachings, who know exactly what's going on. And because of that, it is a natural audience to talk about such things. So be careful here. It's important not to kind of run ahead of ourselves, because then you might destroy all the beauty which is actually available there. Okay, the last one is from Marcel from Slovakia. Hello, Marcel. And he asks, how should we view pleasure? How should we view pleasure from meditation? In other words, how should we view the pleasure you gain from meditation, right? That's what you're asking. And how you should view that pleasure is as something positive, because meditation without pleasure is not real meditation. It has to have pleasure in it. If you look at how the way the Buddha described meditation, it is a sequence of steps that arise before meditation becomes really solid. Real meditation in Buddhism is called samadhi. Samadhi means unification of the mind. Jhana, if you like, jayati, to meditate. And that sequence that leads up to that always has happiness in it. It starts off with the ordinary happiness of the world, the gladness, pamojja in Pali. Then you have the rapture, the feeling of pleasure coursing through the body. Then that starts to calm down and you get a more peaceful kind of happiness. And that peaceful kind of happiness becomes very powerful. It's all about pleasure all the way through. Absolutely. And as that pleasure becomes more profound, the more still the mind becomes, and the more happy you are, and the less craving you have. And then eventually the meditation becomes immensely powerful. And then you deepen that pleasure more and more and more until you wouldn't know that so much pleasure was possible, basically. That's how this path basically works. That is what is so amazing with this path, that you had no idea that so much pleasure was even possible for a human being. It's quite wonderful, isn't it? How can you not do this? Do you want to ordain now, perhaps? Anybody wants to raise their hand? This is the time. Anyway, I'm just messing around now. So, any more questions before we call it a night? Eddie? Yeah, okay.
Ajahn Brahmali, I like the second question, the person who asked from Germany. Yeah. Ajahn Brahmali, we human beings, we've been conditioned, conditioned to think that we get happiness from outside, from the five senses. Okay? Like all this, holidays, blah, blah, 5-star cruise, all the sensual pleasures. Okay, yeah. So the thing is, this is outside is not the real pleasure, okay? The real pleasure is from inside, all right? If you, refer to the kingdom of heaven lies within, Yeah, and then what I call in Buddhism, we have insight awakening, which is enlightenment, okay? Leads to nibbana, which is end of suffering, okay? But we can't tell someone, okay, to just go into this, isn't it? So they have it takes someone to, how do I say, to taste, the bitterness of the fruit, the suffering, okay? Experience this thing before they can realize that the inside one, that's the true one. Do you understand what I mean?
Yes, I understand what you mean.
Yeah. So you have to sort of go through that suffering, that what they call that perseverance, the endurance or whatever, okay? And then to realize it and come up with it, and find the happiness within, not outside.
Yes, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think many people, they have suffering in their life. They want to find a way way out of suffering. And often what they do is that then they become interested in something spiritual because they have a problem. They want to resolve that problem. That's often what happens. But of course, what I'm talking about here is something much more profound, really, because I'm saying that even the things we take to be happiness, even if you're depressed, you still want to eat, right? You still want to enjoy pleasures. But I'm saying that even these things tend to fade into the background when you move into the real spiritual happiness in life. But yes, you're right. Often that is a kind of turning point for people. So that is true. Okay, anybody else want to say anything? Everybody happy? Okay, let's pay our respects to the Buddha Dhamma Sangha.